Hello, everybody, and welcome to Lady Eaton College. This is the final installment of the TrentTalks series for 2012-2013. Since I'm the principal of Lady Eaton College, I get a kick at the can of speaking too. So what I really like to speak about is the division between arts and sciences, or perhaps more accurately, the relationship between the arts and the sciences. And as some of you may know, I teach the brand new course called Knowing and Wondering, which is the core course for the Bachelor of Arts and Science program here at Trent University. It's a new program. And I didn't get to pick the title of the course, Knowing and Wondering, so when they said, Michael, please, could you teach this course? I was excited, but then I needed to take some time to wonder what knowing and wondering was all about. And I did take some time to think about what knowing and wondering was all about. And I came up with some interesting ideas. And first of all, I looked at the core essence of what knowing and wondering, what I could teach a course about. And it sounded like I could teach anything, because indeed, is there something essentially human about knowing and wondering? It's all about us. It's all how we experience the world around us, how we experience nature. And in particular, if you look at the words knowing and wondering, I wanted to dig down. If you look at the word wonder, I see wonder as more of an infinite activity. It's an activity which engages us as people with our imaginations. It is indeed very infinite. Where knowing, on the other hand, I see as more finite. Because when we want to know something, we want to hive it off. We want to divide it down. We want to distill, boil it down, and find out the details. And therefore, by very definition, knowing something is taking the infinite and making it more finite. Now, neither is good nor bad. Both are important, and both are something that we all as humans have the capacity to do. We all have the capacity to wonder. We all have the capacity to know. But it does show a fundamental division, this division between the infinite and the finite. And when we talk about arts and sciences, that too is a traditional dichotomy that has existed for a very, very long time. In fact, if you go back to classical Greece, the Greeks had a word for arts. It was called techne, which meant a craft or with a hand. Of course, in ancient Greek, they had another word that went with techne, which was sophia, which is wisdom or with the mind. So going back thousands of years already in the Western thought and in Western knowledge, there's this sense of a division between the mind and between the hands. If you get to Rome, of course the Romans were great copiers. They cribbed almost everything that the Greeks, ancient Greeks did, and they had words as well, except they were Latin words that meant the same thing. They had ars, which, or ars, but I'll say ars, my Latin pronunciation is a little weak. So ars, which means art, or again, craft with the hands. And they also had the word scientia, which meant knowledge or with the mind. So again, this division that we have between the mind and the hands is quite old. Now this division, I'll talk about quickly tonight, has not always been a fundamental rift between the arts and sciences. And in fact, throughout the Western world over history, there are times when arts and sciences were more together. You can see that in people such as Leonardo da Vinci, a real Renaissance man, which brought the arts and sciences together. And there are times when the arts and sciences were more separated. And you can see that in the medieval university, for example, where scholars were truly cloistered, separated in an ivory tower or ivory cloister away from the rest of the community. You can see this division from the Renaissance on as the scientific method took hold, where a new method of looking at things, a way to banish witchcraft and false belief with a method that was tried and true, and if you followed that method over and over again, that you would have results that you could truly experience and argue. The Enlightenment of the 18th century was truly a time where we were close to the pinnacle of that idea of experience. It was a time based on empiricism, a time based on classification, a time where it was very important to experience the world around you, but then very clearly classify it in your understanding of it. And as we moved to the 19th century, of course, we had an explosion in disciplines thanks to the Enlightenment and people thinking more about the scientific way or the measurable way of doing things. And we see the disciplines that we know today exploding and growing in the 19th century, and we see the birth of the social sciences, the whole idea that man itself, as abstract and random as man could actually be measurable through different ologies, psychology, sociology, and the rest that began in the 19th century. This whole long talk is to talk about this, the separations that can occur, the whole idea between the growth of science as a mental exercise and the division of the arts. And you can really see it in the past 400 years, how, again, we had entered into an era where there's a rift growing between the two. And sometimes this rift was darn violent. Let me tell you, there was the St. Scholastica riots, the famous St. Scholastica riots of 1355 in Oxford, England. Now, some of you may have heard of these riots. They lasted 2 days. Over 60 students or scholars at the university were killed. Another 30 townsfolk in Oxford were killed. Why? Because somebody in a local pub, one of the scholars, uttered the erudite phrase, "This beer sucks." And the townsfolk were enraged that a scholar would criticize the quality of the beer, and 90 people die in the end of it. That is probably an extreme example of the arts and sciences crashing into each other. And indeed, you see that outside of the academic realm of all those disciplines in that, arts and science really seems to be a division between you know, the folk, the working folk with their hands, and the mindful folk with the minds. Another example of this happening, it was in 1791. I'm a historian, so I know I keep shouting at dates. But in 1791 in Birmingham, there was a fellow named Joseph Priestley. Some of you may have heard of him. He was a scientist. He was also a Protestant dissenter and kind of annoying with his piousness. And so the good people of Birmingham, inspired by events of the French Revolution perhaps, went and burned down Joseph Priestley's house, burned his notes, destroyed his equipment, and then anyone else in the scientific society called the Lunar Society in Birmingham, fellow members also had their homes burned down, and the riot grew. Why? Because these scientists were seen as elite, as people who were thinking with their minds, and in a weird kind of twist, because of this religious piety, there was a sense that religion infused the science as well, and their dissenting or different religion that separated those scientists even more from the general folk. Again, the mind versus the hands. And of course, those are extreme examples. With this arts and scientia, this arts and science divide really just simmers, percolates underneath the surface. And you can see it in literature and jibes between artsies versus scientists. And I have a quote here that I wanted to read. And this shows, you know, the depth in which this division has gone through. Indeed, a very wise and ancient sage, a sage from a long time ago, in a galaxy far, far away, who was fluent in over 6 million forms of communication, once admonished his sidekick and friend R2-D2 with the words, "For a mechanic, you seem to do an incessant amount of thinking." And so indeed it hits popular culture, this idea of arts and science. There are people with the hands and they should be staying with the hands, and people with the minds and staying with the minds. Academically, I'm talking more in the basic sense outside of the academe. In the university, it becomes more of a finer point. Indeed, it becomes arts offers a set of methods and modalities that are different than the scientific method, and those divisions happen that way. And perhaps the most greatest example of not fisticuffs, but a war, was the science wars of the 1990s. Now, some of you may have heard of this, where you had on one side scientists who truly believed in empirical science versus what they saw were postmodern humanists that believed in the deconstruction of everything. And you cannot live in a world where you have empiricism versus postmodernism. And one fellow named Alan Sokal, a physicist, published in a cultural studies journal a parody paper, an entirely bogus paper on cultural studies, which was accepted and published. And he said, and it was from Duke University, and he said, "Aha, proof positive, there you go. Those humanists don't have any methods that are worth having, because I can write a bogus paper and it can be published as truth." So volleys were fired back and forth, and in fact, the scientists had their own problems. There were the Boganov twins, two Russian science presenters, science journalists, that became one a physicist and one a mathematician, and then started publishing themselves in peer-reviewed journals in theoretical physics. And it turned out that their papers were fraudulent. And so the whole idea of theory, the whole peer review process was then put under the microscope in the scientific world. It's like, oh my goodness, how could you allow this to happen? How could you let this happen in peer-reviewed science? So of course, this era of the science wars, just over a decade ago, has calmed down. It shows how there are grand divisions between the arts and sciences, divisions outside of the university, and divisions inside of university. Now, I don't want to go on too much longer, but I did want to conclude looking at these divisions. And I think, without being reductionist, that science and arts can share and have commonalities, and not the lowest common denominator. I think there are very important commonalities that both science and the humanities share. And that is, I think both the sciences and the arts offer a means to observe, a means to not only observe, but experience, explain, and express nature. They just do it in different ways and with different understandings. And I don't know if you've seen this poster, but there's a poster that was circulating around Facebook that had a man in a white lab coat, the typical scientist, in a test tube saying, "Science can teach you how to clone a dinosaur." I'm not quite sure that is true, but that's what the poster said. And then underneath the poster had a secondary image of the same scientist running away from a T-Rex saying, "But the humanities can tell you why this is a bad idea." Now, I like that because it acknowledges that there's a place for both the arts and sciences, but what's upsetting about that is that it still seems like the places are quite separate. And indeed, I did an informal, non-scientific, notice how I say that, poll before I did this talk tonight, and I talked to many people in the humanities. I said, "Does science influence you at all?" And they said, "Yes, in all my work, I either use scientific method or scientific ways, or I either use science as a foil against my work. Science influences the way I do my humanities." And then I asked some scientists, "Does arts influence your work?" And some of these people were very creative. They were pianists and musicians and artists, and they're like, "No, I have my art world where I perform art, and I have my science world where I perform science." And I think in that is the core issue that needs to be pulled out a bit and looked at, that sometimes, there doesn't seem to be, in some people's minds, any links or bridges between the arts and sciences. So this evening, there will be 4 different speakers talking about their perspective on education, on the arts, on the sciences. And I want to ask some questions such as, and I want you to also ask yourselves, I want you to wonder, and perhaps at the end we may know something a little more, but I want you to ask yourselves, can a bridge be built between the arts and the sciences? I want you to ask yourself, should bridges be built between the arts and the sciences? And perhaps, more importantly, we should think and say, maybe there are already bridges that exist between the arts and the sciences. All we need to do is take the time and look for them. So thank you very much.